The silence in the National Press Club stretched on as Dr. Traoré gathered herself for what everyone sensed would be the climax of her response. Senator Vance had stopped fidgeting entirely, his political instincts telling him that something significant was about to happen. The cameras remained fixed on Traoré's face, capturing the moment of quiet determination before she continued. "Senator," she said, her voice now carrying a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, "I want to tell you about the day I became an American citizen." She walked back toward the podium but did not stand behind it, instead, positioning herself where she could see both Vance and the entire audience. It was a Tuesday morning in March, 15 years ago. I stood in a courthouse in downtown Chicago with 137 other people from 42 different countries. We had all spent years studying American history, American government, American values. We had all passed tests that many people born here could not pass. Her eyes found Vance's and held them steadily. But the most powerful moment of that ceremony was not when we recited the Oath of Allegiance, though that was profound. It was not when the judge congratulated us on becoming Americans, though that was moving. It was when I looked around that room and saw the faces of my fellow new citizens. Traoré's voice began to carry an emotion that had been carefully controlled until now. There was Mrs. Chen, who had fled China after her husband was imprisoned for speaking out against the government. There was Ahmed, a young man from Syria whose entire family had been killed in the Civil War. There was Maria, who had worked 3 jobs for 8 years to bring her children from Guatemala to safety. She paused, allowing the human faces and stories to sink in before continuing. And there was Samuel, an elderly man from Nigeria, who told me afterward that his grandfather had been enslaved and brought to America against his will over a century ago. Samuel said he was completing a circle that his ancestor never could have imagined, voluntarily choosing to become part of a country that had once owned his family. The audience was completely transfixed now. Even Senator Vance seemed to have forgotten his prepared talking points, drawn into the narrative despite himself. This was not the political theater he was accustomed to. This was something far more powerful and far more dangerous to his worldview. "Do you know what I saw in that room, Senator?" Traoré asked, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "I saw America, not the mythical America of political speeches or campaign commercials, but the real America. The America that has always been built by people who chose to be here, who sacrificed everything they had known for the promise of something better." She moved closer to where Vance was sitting, not in a threatening way, but with the intensity of someone who desperately needed to be understood. "When you declare war on immigrants, you declare war on the very essence of what has always made this country exceptional. You declare war on the idea that America is not defined by bloodlines or birthplaces, but by shared commitment to ideals that transcend any single ethnicity, religion, or culture." The room erupted in spontaneous applause, but Traoré raised her hand gently to quiet it. She was not seeking applause, she was seeking understanding. When the room quieted again, she continued with what would become the most quoted portion of her speech. "Senator Vance, you asked Americans to choose sides in a war. But I am here to tell you that there is no war between real Americans and fake Americans, between native-born and naturalized citizens, between those who have been here for generations and those who arrived yesterday. There is only the eternal struggle between those who believe in the promise of America and those who have lost faith in it." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone in the room to lean forward to hear her. "And I am here to tell you that my faith in America is stronger than your fear of it. My love for this country is deeper than your suspicion of it. My commitment to its ideals is more powerful than your desire to divide it." Senator Vance found himself in an impossible position. Everything in his political playbook told him to interrupt, to challenge, to reassert control of the narrative. But something about Traoré's presence, about the authenticity of her words, about the obvious sincerity of her commitment to the country they both claimed to serve, left him momentarily speechless. Dr. Traoré walked back to the center of the space between the podium and the audience, positioning herself where she could address everyone in the room simultaneously. "I know that there are people watching this who agree with Senator Vance, who believe that people like me pose a threat to their way of life. To them, I want to say this. I understand your fears because I have lived through what happens when those fears are allowed to consume a society. Her final words came slowly, deliberately, each one chosen for maximum impact. But I also want you to know that I am not your enemy. I am your neighbor, your colleague, your fellow citizen. I teach your children. I pay taxes to support your communities. I vote to shape our shared future. And when disaster strikes, when tragedy befalls this country, I grieve as you grieve and I hope as you hope. Because this is my home too. The silence that followed was profound and complete. It was the kind of silence that occurs when something fundamental has shifted in a room, when people realize they have witnessed something that will be remembered long after the immediate circumstances are forgotten. Senator Vance sat frozen, staring at this woman who had just systematically dismantled everything he thought he knew about political discourse. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Dr. Traoré remained standing in the center of the room, her hands clasped quietly in front of her, waiting to see how the room would respond. The weight of her words hung in the air like a challenge to everything that Senator Vance represented, everything his political career had been built upon. Moderator Robert Chen finally broke the silence, his voice slightly hoarse as he attempted to return some normalcy to the proceedings. Dr. Traoré, thank you for those powerful remarks. Senator Vance, would you like to respond? All eyes turned to the senator, who had remained motionless throughout Traoré's entire speech. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. His media training screamed at him to pivot, to deflect, to return to his prepared talking points about national security and economic concerns. But something about the moment, something about the authenticity of what he had just witnessed, made his usual political responses feel suddenly hollow and inadequate. Vance stood slowly, his usual confidence notably absent. When he spoke, his voice lacked the commanding presence that had characterized his television interview just weeks earlier. Dr. Traoré, he began, then paused, seeming to search for words that had always come so easily before. What you've said. He walked toward the podium but stopped halfway there, as if uncertain of his destination. The audience watched in fascination as one of the most polished politicians in America struggled to find his footing in the face of simple, honest, truth-telling. I want to be clear, he finally managed, that when I spoke about protecting American interests, I never intended to suggest that naturalized citizens were somehow less American than. His voice trailed off as he realized how defensive and inadequate his words sounded. In the span of 15 minutes, Dr. Traoré had managed to expose the fundamental emptiness at the heart of his political message. She had not attacked him personally, had not questioned his patriotism or his motives. Instead, she had simply presented an alternative vision of what America could be, and in doing so, had made his vision seem small and fearful by comparison. From the audience, someone called out, "Senator, do you still believe we're at war?" The question cut through the awkwardness of the moment, forcing Vance to confront the very declaration that had started this entire controversy. Vance looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him expectantly. These were not just political opponents or media adversaries. These were Americans of all backgrounds, ages, and political persuasions who had come to hear a substantive discussion about the direction of their country. Many of them had been moved to tears by Traoré's words, and they were now waiting to see if he would rise to meet the moment she had created. I believe, he said slowly, choosing his words more carefully than perhaps he ever had in his political career, that we face challenges as a nation, serious challenges, but perhaps I chose the wrong word when I spoke of war. It was not exactly a retraction, but it was closer to an acknowledgement of error than anyone had expected from Senator Vance. Dr. Traoré, still standing near the center of the room, nodded slightly in recognition of what must have been a difficult admission for him to make. The moderator, sensing an opportunity to build on this unexpected moment of vulnerability, asked a follow-up question. Senator, having heard Dr. Traoré's perspective, How do you respond to her assertion that fear-based politics ultimately weakens rather than strengthens America? Vance was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a thoughtfulness that had been absent from his recent public appearances. Dr. Traoré speaks from experience that I do not have. She has seen what happens when political rhetoric when it leads to actual division and conflict. I respect that perspective. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal before continuing. I still believe that we need to have serious conversations about immigration policy, about national security, about ensuring that American workers are protected. But I can see how the language I used might have suggested that there was something inherently threatening about people who choose to make America their home. The audience remained completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern political discourse. A powerful politician actually grappling with the impact of his words, rather than simply defending or deflecting. Dr. Traoré took a small step forward, her expression showing neither triumph nor vindication, but rather a kind of hopeful curiosity. Senator, she said quietly, may I ask you something? Vance nodded, though he appeared uncertain about what might come next. When you think about the America you want to protect and preserve, she asked, what do you see? What are the values, the principles, the characteristics that you believe make this country worth defending? It was a question that cut to the heart of everything, bypassing political strategy and campaign messaging to address the fundamental question of what America actually meant to both of them. The room waited in anticipation, understanding that Vance's answer might determine whether this unexpected moment of dialogue would lead to genuine understanding or simply return to the familiar patterns of political combat. Dr. Amara Traoré stood behind the podium, her hands resting lightly on the wood surface as she looked out at the packed auditorium. The silence was deafening, broken only by the quiet whir of television cameras and the subtle rustle of papers, as journalists prepared to capture every word. She could see Senator Vance in her peripheral vision, seated at the panel table with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Traoré simply stood there, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying easily to the back of the auditorium without any theatrical projection or political grandstanding. Senator Vance, she began, her eyes finding his across the room, you spoke of war. You declared it on live television and millions of Americans heard you, but I wonder if you truly understand what war means to those of us who have actually lived through it. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. This was not how anyone had expected her to begin. Political responses typically started with pleasantries, acknowledgments of the moderator, or broad statements about the importance of dialogue. Traoré had chosen instead to immediately and directly address the elephant in the room. She continued, her voice gaining strength without losing its measured tone. I was 12 years old when conflict came to my village in Mali. I watched my neighbors, people who had lived side by side for generations, turn against each other because politicians convinced them that their problems were caused by those who looked different, spoke different languages, or practiced different traditions. Vance shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his media training warring with his instinct to interrupt. The cameras captured every micro-expression as Traoré's words began to paint a picture that was both deeply personal and devastatingly universal. The war you declared, Senator, is not new. It is as old as human civilization itself. It is the war that turns neighbor against neighbor, that transforms communities into battlegrounds, that reduces complex human beings into simple categories of us and them. Her voice carried no anger, no accusation, just a profound sadness that seemed to fill the entire room. Dr. Traoré moved slightly away from the podium, making her presence more immediate and personal. You spoke of foreign elements infiltrating our communities, our schools, our government institutions. I am one of those elements, Senator. I teach at an American university. I pay American taxes. I vote in American elections. My students, many of whom are the children and grandchildren of immigrants themselves, learn about the very democratic principles that brought me to this country in the first place. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the journalists had stopped typing, their attention fully captured by the unfolding moment. Traoré's response was unlike anything they had witnessed in recent political discourse. It was neither defensive nor aggressive, neither pleading nor accusatory. It was something far more powerful. It was profoundly human. "But perhaps," she continued, "you believe that someone like me, someone who was not born on this soil, cannot truly understand what it means to be American. Let me tell you what I learned about America before I ever set foot on its shores." She paused, allowing the question to hang in the air before continuing. "I learned about a country that declared all men are created equal, even when that declaration was written by men who owned other human beings. I learned about a nation that welcomed the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, even when those very masses were met with suspicion and hostility by those who had arrived." Just generations before, Senator Vance found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in despite himself by the cadence and content of her words. This was not the angry rebuttal his team had prepared him to counter. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to cut through the usual political theater and speak to something deeper. "I learned about a country that fought a civil war to preserve the Union and end slavery, that welcomed refugees from Europe's wars, that opened its doors to those fleeing persecution and poverty from every corner of the globe. Not because it was easy, Senator, but because it understood that diversity of thought, experience, and perspective made it stronger." Traoré's voice grew slightly stronger as she approached the heart of her response. "The America I fell in love with was not perfect. It never claimed to be, but it aspired to be better. It recognized that the work of building a more perfect union was never finished, that each generation had to recommit itself to the ideals that made this country exceptional." She turned slightly, addressing not just Vance but the entire audience, and by extension the millions watching at home. "When you declare war on people like me, Senator, you are not protecting America. You are diminishing it. You are taking a country that has always been at its best when it opened its arms to the world, and turning it into something smaller, something fearful, something unworthy of the sacrifices made by generations of Americans who believed in something greater than themselves." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Several audience members wiped away tears, while others sat in stunned silence. Even the hardened journalists seemed moved by the power of her testimony. But Dr. Traoré was not finished. She had saved the most powerful part of her response for last, and what she said next would be remembered long after the political rhetoric of the day had been forgotten. The aftermath of Vance's television appearance was immediate and explosive. Within hours, his office was flooded with calls from supporters and detractors alike. His chief of staff, Maria Santos, paced frantically in the corridor outside his office, fielding calls from donors, party leadership, and media outlets demanding clarification. The senator's spontaneous declaration had caught even his own team completely off guard, and they scrambled to control the narrative before it spiraled beyond their influence. Meanwhile, Dr. Amara Traoré sat at her small dining table, surrounded by books on political theory, historical documents, and legal texts. Her laptop screen glowed in the dim evening light as she carefully crafted what would become her response to Vance's declaration. She wrote and rewrote sentences, weighing each word for its potential impact. This wasn't just about defending herself or her community. This was about defending the very principles that had drawn her to America in the first place. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and former students who had seen Vance's interview and knew that Traoré would have something meaningful to say. As one of the most respected voices in academic circles on issues of immigration and human rights, her perspective was sought after by journalists and policymakers alike. But Traoré wasn't interested in giving a quick quote or a reactive sound bite. She was preparing something much more substantial. Across the country, Vance's words had triggered responses from various corners of American society. Civil rights organizations issued strongly worded statements. Religious leaders called for calm and compassion. Business groups worried about the economic implications of potential policy changes. But none of these responses seemed to capture the full weight of what had just occurred on live television. 3 days after the interview, an invitation arrived in Dr. Traoré's email that would change everything. The National Press Club was hosting an emergency forum on political rhetoric and national unity, and they wanted her to serve as one of the keynote speakers. The forum would be broadcast live on multiple networks, giving her access to the same kind of platform that Vance had used to make his declaration. More importantly, Senator Vance himself had agreed to participate in the forum, setting up what many were already calling a potential confrontation. Traoré stared at the invitation for several minutes before accepting. She understood the magnitude of what she was agreeing to do. This wasn't an academic conference where she could speak to like-minded scholars in the comfort of intellectual discourse. This would be a national stage with millions watching, including those who might view her very presence as validation of Vance's claims about foreign elements in American society. The week leading up to the forum was intense. Traoré received coaching from media professionals, though she insisted on maintaining her authentic voice rather than adopting the polished speaking style typical of television personalities. She also received security briefings as threats had been made against several of the forum participants. The country seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from this high-stakes encounter. On the day of the forum, the National Press Club was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from major networks set up their equipment while security personnel carefully screened attendees. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and underlying tension. Politicians, academics, activists, and ordinary citizens had all found ways to secure seats for what many believed would be a pivotal moment in American political discourse. Dr. Traoré arrived early, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that her mother had sent from Mali years earlier. She carried with her a single folder containing her prepared remarks, though she had memorized every word. As she walked through the club's historic halls, she thought about all the important speeches that had been delivered in these rooms over the decades, and she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Senator Vance arrived with his usual entourage of staff members and security personnel. He appeared confident and relaxed, joking with reporters and shaking hands with supporters in the audience. His media team had spent the week framing his appearance as an opportunity to clarify his message and engage in productive dialogue. But those who knew him well could detect a subtle tension in his demeanor, a recognition that this forum might not unfold as predictably as his usual political appearances. The moderator, veteran journalist Robert Chen, opened the forum by acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. He outlined the format. Each speaker would have 15 minutes for opening remarks, followed by a moderated discussion and audience questions. The order had been determined by lottery, and fate had decreed that Dr. Traoré would speak immediately after Senator Vance. As Vance approached the podium for his opening remarks, the room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing every expression as he began to speak. His prepared statement was notably more measured than his television interview, but the core message remained the same. He spoke of protecting American values, securing borders, and ensuring that immigration policies served the interests of existing citizens first and foremost. When he finished, polite applause rippled through parts of the audience while others remained conspicuously silent. Chen thanked the senator and then called Dr. Traoré to the podium. As she stood and walked toward the front of the room, the tension became palpable. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The cameras tracked her movement, and across the nation, millions of viewers leaned forward in their chairs, eager to hear how this soft-spoken professor would respond to one of the most powerful politicians in the country. The television studio buzzed with anticipation as the morning news program prepared for what would become one of the most shocking political moments of the year. Senator James Vance sat confidently in the guest chair, his crisp navy suit perfectly pressed, his campaign pin gleaming under the bright studio lights. Across from him, the veteran news anchor Sarah Mitchell shuffled her papers, unaware that she was about to witness a declaration that would change everything. The red recording light flickered on, and millions of viewers tuned in for what they expected to be a routine political interview. Vance had been making the rounds on various networks, promoting his new policy proposals and defending his recent voting record. His media team had briefed him thoroughly, providing talking points and safe responses to potential controversial questions. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated for another successful television appearance. In a modest apartment 3,000 miles away, Dr. Amara Traoré watched the screen with growing unease. The soft-spoken professor of international relations had been following Vance's career with increasing concern over the past few months. His rhetoric had grown more aggressive, his policies more divisive, and his attacks on immigrant communities more personal. As someone who had immigrated to America 15 years earlier from Mali, Traoré understood the dangerous path that such language could create. The interview began pleasantly enough, with Mitchell asking standard questions about upcoming legislation and budget proposals. Vance answered with his usual political polish, delivering practiced sound bites that his team had crafted for maximum impact. His supporters watching at home nodded approvingly, while his critics rolled their eyes at the familiar talking points. Nobody expected what was coming next. As the commercial break ended, Mitchell decided to shift the conversation toward immigration policy, a topic that had dominated recent headlines. The camera zoomed in on Vance's face as she asked about his stance on refugee resettlement programs. Something in his expression changed almost imperceptibly, a hardening around his eyes that suggested the carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack. What happened next would be replayed countless times on social media, analyzed by political commentators, and remembered as a turning point in American political discourse. Vance leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a tone that was both measured and menacing. The words that came out of his mouth were not in his prepared talking points, were not approved by his media team, and would send shockwaves through political circles across the nation. "Let me be absolutely clear about something," Vance said, his eyes fixed directly on the camera. "We are at war. Not a war with guns and tanks, but a war for the soul of this country. And I'm declaring today that we will no longer sit idly by while foreign elements infiltrate our communities, our schools, our government institutions. This ends now." The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of the cameras. Mitchell's eyes widened as she processed what she had just heard. Her years of journalistic experience had prepared her for many things, but not for a sitting senator to essentially declare war on live television. She quickly glanced at her producer in the control room, who was frantically signaling for her to continue the interview, despite the explosive nature of Vance's statement. In her apartment, Dr. Traoré felt her heart rate increase as the implications of Vance's words sank in. She had heard similar rhetoric before, in different countries, in different times. She recognized the dangerous precedent being set, the way political language could quickly transform into real-world consequences for vulnerable communities. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, knowing that she needed to respond, but uncertain of how her voice could possibly compete with the platform that Vance commanded. The senator continued his impromptu declaration, his voice growing more passionate with each word. He spoke of reclaiming America, of protecting real citizens, and of implementing policies that would fundamentally change how the country approached immigration and multiculturalism. His words were coded enough to maintain plausible deniability, yet clear enough that his intended audience understood exactly what he meant. Social media exploded within minutes. Hashtags related to Vance's statements began trending worldwide. His supporters praised his courage and honesty, while his critics expressed horror at what they saw as dangerous extremism being broadcast into millions of homes. News outlets scrambled to provide context and analysis, while political opponents began preparing their responses. But in that modest apartment, Dr. Traoré was crafting something different. Unlike the immediate reactionary posts flooding social media, unlike the carefully worded statements that would soon come from political figures, she was preparing a response that would draw from her deep understanding of history, her personal experience as an immigrant, and her professional expertise in international relations. She had no idea that her response would not only stun the room where it would eventually be delivered, but would also become a defining moment in the national conversation about who America truly was and who it aspired to be. Senator Vance stood motionless for several long seconds, Dr. Traoré's question hanging in the air between them. The cameras captured every nuance of his expression as he seemed to grapple not just with how to answer, but with what the answer actually was. For perhaps the first time in his political career, he was being asked to articulate not what he was against, but what he was truly for. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, lacking the practiced projection of his typical public appearances. When I think about the America I want to protect, he began hesitantly. I think about the small town in Ohio where I grew up. I think about neighbors helping neighbors, about communities where people knew each other's names, where there was a sense of shared purpose and mutual responsibility. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, closing some of the physical distance between himself and Dr. Traoré. I think about the idea that hard work should be rewarded, that people should have the opportunity to build better lives for their children, that there should be some measure of fairness and justice in how society operates. Dr. Traoré nodded slightly, recognizing values that she too held dear. Those are beautiful ideals, Senator. They are, in fact, many of the same ideals that drew me to America. But may I ask you this? In your vision of that small town in Ohio, is there room for someone who looks like me, who speaks with an accent like mine, who brings different experiences and perspectives to that community? The question was asked without accusation or trap, simply as an invitation for Vance to examine his own assumptions. The audience held its collective breath, understanding that this moment could either bridge a seemingly unbridgeable divide or expose the fundamental incompatibilities in their worldviews. Vance was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving from Dr. Traoré to the audience and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that none of his political supporters or opponents had ever heard before. I want to say yes, he admitted. Standing here, listening to you, seeing the person you are rather than the abstract concept I had in my mind. I want to say yes. He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was entirely human rather than political. But I also have to be honest. The rhetoric I've used, the way I've talked about immigration, about foreign influence, it wasn't really about policy, was it? It was about fear. Fear that the America I grew up in was disappearing. Fear that there wouldn't be room for people like me in whatever was coming next. The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the audience. Politicians rarely acknowledged fear as a motivating factor, preferring to frame their positions in terms of strength and principle. But Vance's honesty seemed to create space for a different kind of conversation. Dr. Traoré took a step closer, her expression showing compassion rather than triumph. Senator, may I tell you something that might surprise you? I have some of those same fears. I worry about whether my children will face discrimination because of their names or their appearance. I worry about whether the communities I've come to love will continue to welcome people like my family. I worry about whether the America that gave me so many opportunities will be there for the next generation of immigrants. She smiled slightly, an expression that seemed to illuminate the entire room. But here's what I've learned. When we allow fear to drive our politics, we create the very divisions we're afraid of. When we assume the worst about each other, we make it impossible to find the common ground that has always been America's greatest strength. The moderator, Robert Chen, leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Traoré, Senator Vance, where do we go from here? How do we have these conversations about immigration, about national identity, about America's future, without falling into the patterns of fear and division that have characterized so much of our recent political discourse? Dr. Traoré looked at Senator Vance, who nodded for her to speak first. I think, she said slowly, we start by remembering that behind every political position is a human being with hopes, fears, dreams, and concerns that are remarkably similar to our own. We start by listening to each other's stories, not to find ammunition for our arguments, but to find the shared humanity that connects us. She gestured toward Vance. The senator spoke about wanting to protect the America he grew up in. I understand that desire because I want to protect the America that welcomed me and gave me opportunities I never could have imagined. Those aren't competing visions. They're complementary ones. Vance nodded slowly. I think you're right. The America you fell in love with, the America that gave you opportunities, that's the same America I want to preserve. Maybe the threat isn't from people who choose to come here and contribute to that vision. Maybe the threat is from those of us who would narrow that vision, who would make it smaller instead of larger. The applause that followed was unlike anything that had been heard in political forums in recent memory. It was not the partisan cheering that typically greeted political red meat, but rather the appreciative recognition of two people who had found a way to speak honestly about difficult topics without demonizing each other. As the forum concluded, and people began to file out of the National Press Club, many wiped away tears while others engaged in animated conversations about what they had just witnessed. Social media exploded with commentary, but for once much of it focused not on who had won or lost, but on what had been gained through the simple act of two people choosing to see each other as fellow human beings rather than political adversaries. Dr. Amara Traoré and Senator James Vance would continue to have policy disagreements in the months that followed. They would likely never agree on all aspects of immigration reform or national security, but on that day, in that room, they had demonstrated something that many had begun to believe was impossible in American politics, that it was still possible to disagree without declaring war, to debate without dehumanizing, and to find common ground without abandoning deeply held principles. The conversation they started that day would ripple outward, inspiring similar dialogues in communities across the country, and reminding Americans of who they could be when they chose courage over fear, understanding over anger, and hope over division.